All right, so IFBB is a wrap. So on the weekend we had 5 competitive state stage for IFBB, 4 of them being males. So we had a couple of the boys in men's physique and a couple of the boys in the classic physique and the bodybuilding juniors as well. And I thought it would be a good idea to potentially put together, well, originally potentially, I'm obviously doing the video now. I thought it would be a good idea to put together a video which goes over their peak weeks and the differential in the way that we went about these peak weeks, because the thing is with peak weeks is typically we can defy logic dramatically during these periods. What works for one individual may not work for another, even though theoretically it may seem sound, so on and so forth. So I thought it'd be a really good idea to get 4 boys who are all similar in age, all similar in size, and compare how we actually approach this. So before I go on, we had 4 boys. So we had Julian, we had Aaron, we had Marco, and we had Jude, 4 members of the team. So 22, 22, 26, 20, 25, 26 years old respectively. So 2 of them juniors, 3 of them first timers, and believe it or not, the 3 of them that were first timers didn't come to me with any intention of actually competing. It was more just to have some kind of composition goals. So the transformations, which I will share on my Instagram page across the next couple of weeks, will be nothing short of impressive. Aaron was the only return competitor, but with Aaron, we did make substantial improvements from his first show into this show. So really happy with how everything went. We didn't necessarily get the placings that we were after. We obviously had Marco place first in the men's physique juniors, but a much smaller lineup. But at the same time, it wasn't a case of we got up there and damn, what could we have done to edge into first place? It was just time. The boys needed more tissue. A lot of them have spent very little time in growth phases with me. I think the longest that we spent in the growth phase was with Jude, who has been under me for probably around 15 months now. And we probably spent out of that 15 months. So if we spent 5 months in prep, we spent the first 3 months cutting as well. So probably spent 6 or 7 months actually building, which if you actually look at that comparison, you'll see that it is quite dramatic as well. So all of them are quite happy with the results. What did I think of the results? If I'm going to talk specifically about peaking them and getting them up to speed, I did think most of them were, I did think all of them were peaked quite well. We had some issues in regards to Julian with spilling, which I am going to go into, and we did have some issues in managing Marco's midsection towards the end, which I will likewise go into. So I'm going to go over without further ado the peak week approaches for each of those individuals. So I have my phone right here. I'm going to break down some of the notes and go through what we actually did. So I'm going to start with Julian. Julian is a longer term client, initially a lifestyle client, initially a unassisted lifestyle client who wanted to take the big IFBB stage, hence going into the assisted route down the line. I'm just trying to find that peak week data. Okay, so the problem we have with Julian's peak, actually, stress got quite high towards the tail end of it, and then we had a lot harder of a time actually making progress compared to the progress that we were making initially, which was not something that I never see, but something that we did learn from. And we took a number of takeaways from this process as well, and we know that next time there are a number of things we will do differently. A number of things, one of the most simple ones being we're going to go with a shorter prep, because we found the longer prep did drive a lot of stress throughout the course of the process, and also just timing our run a little bit better, because I do believe at around that 7-8 week out mark, Julian looked great, and we probably made like very minimal progress from there on in. Julian does have a history of digestive issues, so his loading was very difficult. So if I actually go over his loading, so with Julian's loading, we actually made no variation to his hydration. So Julian was only drinking about 2 liters of water per day. This is just something that he was doing all the way throughout, so I didn't want to change that variable. I believe on the last day, we started to taper that back a little bit towards the back end of the day. Whether this contributed to him holding a little bit more fluid or seeming a bit more fluidy on stage, I'm not too sure. But this was basically just to try and keep him as empty as possible, because he does bloat quite significantly. So we went from, we flattened him out at around 85 grams of carbohydrates before we jumped to our first day at 253 grams of carbohydrates, which is not a big number. We did this across 5 meals. So with the 253 grams of carbs, he actually claimed that he was really full at this point. But I thought 250 carbs, there's no way he's full. I'm going to tick him up. And the next day I planned 401 grams. I think we got up to about 300 before he sort of started to say, I'm spilling, I'm spilling. Me saying, it's probably in your head, man. Because he does have a tendency to think that he is looking super water in the midsection. But believe it or not, he was in fact spilling. We pulled him back down to 300 again the next day. And then we fed him 170 on the day before the show to try to flatten him out, with most carbs coming out towards the back end of the day, and then very minimal feeding on the day of the show. I think we just did a pro fats meal on the show day, and we just had him drinking to taste. Outside of that, we did use We completely abolished testosterone use, so that was not in there for the last 7 or so days, just with the attempt to manage fluids. And there was a number of other incorporations, such as the incorporation of an ARB. But all in all, you can see that this was a very modest to low load, which was interesting. I do believe we also used vitamin C as a bit of a natural diuretic alongside some astragalus root. This was basically because we did spill him. Did it help? Not really. The spilled look that we got on the Thursday, the show being on the Saturday, was very reflective of the look that we had on the show day. Nonetheless, he did look like he belonged up there. Okay, probably could have been a little bit sharper. I don't think even if we peaked it well, it would have made a substantial difference. I think it was just a matter of actually bringing him in from the start in as good condition as possible. I'm going to take you to my next one, which is Jude. Okay, so I am going to get the data up again for Jude. Okay, Jude, the reason I've gone straight into this one is because it is a very different kind of peak approach. Okay, and it's a very different circumstance, which you probably will find quite interesting. So Jude, again, another first timer. We'd had less trials with carbohydrates across the course of the prep. Why, I couldn't really tell you, but Drew did get very, very flat, like very, very flat. And the funniest part was he was on 2,500 calories for a majority of the tail end of the prep, and we didn't really go lower. I think we went lower once or twice. But with Jude, he was one of those situations where we actually kept testosterone quite high. We kept fluid as normal, we kept salts as normal, and we didn't really incorporate anything out of the ordinary to get things moving. I think maybe a little bit of vitamin C on the back end of the last day, just to sort of prevent any excess fluid retention. But his carb load actually started on the Monday. So we started the Monday, according to this, we started at 655 grams of carbohydrates on the Monday. And before we knew it, we were at 800 the following day, so Tuesday, 800 the following day, Wednesday, 1,000 on the Thursday, and we sat close to 700 on the Friday as well. And I still would say that he wasn't quite full, okay? He was still quite flat. And this was a very interesting one. We actually had a couple of episodes where we thought we were going hypoglycemic reactively, which was quite interesting as well, but definitely a unique situation. Following the feeding after the show as well, he did maintain quite a sharp look, still looking really good today as per his progress photos. But this was a case of no changes in fluids, no changes in salts, okay? Basically, we just had to keep feeding him, keep feeding and make sure digestion stuck. And the funniest part was, his body weight would not go down in those last couple of weeks of prep, but as soon as this food started coming in, his body weight would not stay up. So we just kept feeding. And I think he started the load at around 81.8 and he wrapped up around 83, which probably tells you that he still had a lot of room to move, which was quite interesting. Aaron was a very similar kind of circumstance, okay? And again, had a lot of food in there. So we will see how this one sort of panned out as well. All right, just gonna get the numbers up so we can see exactly what it looks like. So we have the peak week there. Again, Aaron was on about 100 carbs prior to carb loading. But then before we know it, 500, 750, 900, 750 the day before show. We did manage fluid and sodium a little bit more, but the difference here was that Aaron had in fact competed before, has experimented himself before, and I did to some degree take his word on what would work and what wouldn't, as well as some diuresis on the back end of the Friday as well coming into the Saturday. I do actually think that this was the most optimal peak of the lot of them. But interestingly enough, again, another lad who did require a lot of food. Arguably, I think could have been a little bit fuller. Probably could have fed him like maybe around 1,000 for the 2 or 3 days carbohydrates and he would have comfortably sat there. But you live and you learn. I did have concerns around spilling him because he would hold a lot of fluid around that lower back region and he would wash out his midsection a little bit too, which are two areas which we didn't want in. We didn't want the lower back to sort of spill over because that would give the perception that he wasn't as lean as he actually was, and the midsection was one of his stronger points, so it wasn't something that we were willing to jeopardize either. And then the last but not least, we move into Marco. So this was definitely a more interesting one, and the reason being because we needed to... He had a tendency to hold a film of fluid over his midsection and front line / chest, okay? So in having the tendency to do so, we needed to fill him up to a point where we could do this like fill him up nicely without this happening, because it would blow out very, very easily. And I took a couple of risks here, and I believe we sat around that 4 to 450 mark for 2 or 3 days. Carbohydrates, very modest. We kept a modest load into up to about 24 hours out from the show, and then we pulled him pretty close to 0, or not necessarily 0, but it was definitely sub 50 carbs from around 2 or 3 o'clock on the Friday. I actually chose to manipulate sodium a little bit here too, just to see what would happen. This did to some degree backfire, but nonetheless, if you do look at his stage shots, you can see the areas where we were holding more fluid, just mostly around that stomach, okay, were areas where there was a little bit less development as opposed to the back, which was fucking sharp, okay. The legs as well, we had some trouble with them over the last couple of weeks, so the fatigue mitigation strategies were significant, but we did manage to get the legs into where they needed to be, which was quite interesting. But again, you can see, if you've got Marco and Jude, similar weight, similar height, one requiring 1,000 times 5 carbohydrates, one requiring 2 times 400 carbohydrates. There's never really an exact science. So my takeaway here, and what did I learn from these peaks? So one of the things that I definitely consolidated was probably not to muck around with salt and water, okay? And the reason I decided not to muck around with salt and water is because I just feel like it creates too much, like a lack of predictability, okay? Unless you and the individual are very confident that these kind of changes are going to be positive for their physique, whether that be because the client's competed before, you've had some trial runs, they've had some experimentations, they might have had a day where they didn't drink till X o'clock because they were busy or something, and then they thought they looked their best, and sometimes you have to trust these words. But in 9 out of 10 cases, we don't muck around with these elements, okay? The second takeaway is always run a practice trial peak. Number 3 is what you think you are probably going to incorporate for a client is probably not the way it's going to go. So what I did, I set up a framework at the start of the week. So what I would say, let's just say for Jude, I believe I had like 400, 600, 750, 750. That was his setup at the start of the week. And then he'd send me photos after every meal. I'd constantly reference that, and obviously that edged up. So you can see if you didn't have a coach who was on it and invested and really just watching every step of the way, it would be very, very difficult to get your best look. But in the same breath, you need to acknowledge if you as a client can't provide the adequate data for the coach to make these changes, the same way you are going to fall short. So it's very important that there is a two-way stream of communication here. Another thing that I definitely learned from these preps was not really a big fan of the longer preps in the enhanced individuals. I don't think they're necessary. I don't think, unless they are, there is going to be cases where they're necessary, but I do think around that 18 to 20 week mark is going to be perfect, especially when you're trying to push someone into a national show, then that's going to become a little bit more difficult again. So it's important to consider all these factors as well. But nonetheless, it was a great experience and plenty that we learned from it. And all these boys have obviously taken a really positive step in the right direction. And I do believe the next time around that they will be as competitive as their hearts desire, depending on the category, because of course, if we're talking about bodybuilding or classic physique, the timeline can be dragged out a little bit more. But we're talking about men's physique, obviously, that's going to be something that can be achieved in the short term. But what I will do, ask any questions you like below. Don't hesitate in reaching out. I'm pretty transparent about everything. Obviously, I skim some details here deliberately for the sake of some degree of privacy, as well as protecting some of the methodologies that I have incorporated here. But nonetheless, thank you for watching on. Have a great day, and I'll speak to you guys soon.